It's Christmas time. Again. So it's time for me to play Dead Rising 4. Again. And so I guess I need to review it. Again.
Oh dear God, it's exactly the same.
Yeah, big surprise. My opinion hasn't changed in the 365 days since my last review. I stand by the points made in that video, even if the audio quality sucks. But since it's not Christmas for a Dead Rising fan, without re-examining the last game that never gets any better on Revisit, I decided to give you all a gift and go for some low-hanging fruit. Vic Chu sucks. She's the worst character in Dead Rising 4 and the franchise as a whole. But how much of that is the fault of her character, and how much of that is the fault of the story she's in? Going into the playthrough with this question, I got an idea for how fundamentally flawed of a character Vic is, how these flaws collapse in on themselves, and how better writing alone might not have saved her. Frank West isn't Frank West. This is the most common criticism of Dead Rising 4's writing, and for good reason. As I said in the review, his characterization has been reset to the start of the first Dead Rising, grossly exaggerated to the point of parody, and then acts like as if any character development hasn't happened since he landed on Willamette back in 2006. He's a jerk who doesn't take anything about the situation seriously, and what little development he does get throughout the story doesn't even put him back to where he was at the end of Dead Rising 1, let alone Case West. It feels like he was written by people who really hate Frank West and really hate they had the right for him. But everyone has said this before, it's hardly new information. What isn't brought up often, though, is the gameplay and story segregation. Frank is meant to be apathetic to everyone in Willamette. So why is the core of the side quests about helping people? It made sense in Dead Rising 1 because they were chances for scoops about the situation, and Frank would reveal his willingness to help others if the player was so inclined. But Frank's character has, for whatever reason, been completely subverted in Dead Rising 4. So now the gameplay is in direct opposition to the values the character has, for no reason other than it's a Dead Rising game, so the side quests are about saving survivors. This leads to the game non-stop, having Frank vocalize his disinterest in the very actions the player is rewarded for engaging. Because if Frank didn't constantly tell you he wasn't interested in taking time out of his day to save people, you'd forget that's supposed to be part of his new characterization here. This results in the same character trait being beaten over the head of the player because the game can't naturally incorporate it into the experience, despite it allegedly defining the narrative. So Frank's character has been reset and undermined to the point of being unrecognizable, and these new traits don't even naturally come up, so you get to hear over and over again how Frank may as well save an innocent life since he's already here. So take what I just said about Frank, and what every other reviewer has said about Frank if you are so inclined, and then add Vic. This college girl showing up whose interactions with the defaced face of the franchise amounting to, I'm you, but I actually do the right thing. Putting aside Vic's writing and actions in the game, do you foresee a situation where the player base actually likes this character? Because I don't. I say that Vic was always going to be disliked because her character exists to further sell the lie that is bland pest. I opened this section talking about Frank because that resentment of Frank's characterization is carried on to Vic when she is used to correct someone who was never this wrong to begin with. And being a well-written character would not immediately fix that core issue. Another problem with Vic before any of her actions come into play, the story doesn't need her to function. Or more accurately, Vic's role in the story is shockingly minimal, and could be removed while giving what little relevance she does have to other characters. Her entire role for Case Zero is to bring Frank back to Willamette, both for the tutorial and as what Brad uses to convince Frank to properly investigate the outbreak. It also brings in the idealism versus cynicism battle with Frank as a journalist. Since Vic only knows about this from a source rather than any information she gathered herself, the source could have just contacted Frank directly about what's going on in Willamette, and sent him the camera filters, since Frank knowing how to modify his camera shouldn't be a far-fetched idea. You also don't need a separate character to have the dilemma of him being a reporter versus being a hero. He can simply take the photo of the half-zombie, contemplate if he should just leave since he's only here to break the story, versus talking to the imprisoned clone to see how sentient she is. Gets caught by Dr. Blackburn because he doesn't hear her enter the room, and then run off and barricade himself with a lot of the failed experiments. There's no need to account for Vic leaving Frank behind at the base and making him a wanted man because it never comes back into play again. And as for Frank getting into Willamette proper, Either make Frank less of a defeated old man so he's actively willing to give it another shot, or just let Brad actually convince Frank to return.
Whoever breaks this, they're in for some big gains. Maybe even win back something. Hell of a team you've assembled. Coming up on Willamette.
Case 1 already sees Vic's usage drop off considerably. Frank asks Connor where to find Vic, which in turn leads him to both the mall's security shelter, which then leads him to the front entrance. The mall is already set up, so Frank has no option but to head to the shelter. Since this game likes to have Frank comment on every last thing he sees, have a line for Frank when he bypasses the shelter in order to continue exploring the mall, and then give another line when he hits a hard dead end and has to go back to that shelter. And as for the shelter investigation, just make it the hideout for Darcy. He was already trying to get to the mall's front entrance, so he would be hiding out there. This also opens up Vic's cloud updates. Most of these only give Vic insight to information the player already knows or will learn very soon. There's some okay foreshadowing and soft introductions to these at least, but you could have any character in Willamette be leaving these lying around. Hammond going over her falling out with Tom in real time, the 4 multiplayer characters talking about their discoveries out in the field, the memoirs of Fontana, literally anyone. And this is ignoring how any unique information these cloud updates could have added could have just been put into Paula's podcasts. Back to the story. Case 2 only sees Vic sailing out Hammond and her squad to interview Fontana. In place of Vic, Darcy could know this information and be willing to sell them out to save his own skin, and Tom can get mad at Paula and Darcy instead of Vic. Not like that plot point goes anywhere either. Darcy can even be the one holding Dr. Blackburn hostage instead of Vic in Case 3. Not that she needs to be held hostage, and this would make about as much sense as having Vic do it while being guarded by... Obscurus. I feel like some context was lost for this scene to begin with. Vic vanishes during Cases 4 and 5 as the fall of Obscurus and the coup against Tom play out without her. Because she doesn't contribute anything to the story only contributes to her screen time. Case 6 does break this with her serving as the bridge between Frank's escape from Calder to his final battle with the monster. And yes, either Dr. Blackburn or Darcy could have served this role instead of Vic, with either Darcy having finally gone off the deep end and trying to take the story for himself, or Blackburn betraying Frank, planning to leave him to die as she escapes with Brad, ensuring she doesn't get held responsible for her part in the occupation. And Brad could be the one to assist Frank against Calder since he's already teleporting behind the scenes for the entire game. Vic is the opposite of Jessica from Dead Rising 1. While Jessica is a passive character who is irreplaceable in Dead Rising 1's plot, I did a video on that if you're interested, Vic is an active character who doesn't impact the story in any manner unique to her. So, again, before even getting into the quality of her character, her narrative purpose is both frustrating and expendable. Okay, onto Vic and the actual story. Vic is often perceived by players as who the game sides with, morally speaking. This is based on the game never having characters heavily criticize her actions, despite having no such reserves for Frank. Frank ultimately bowing down to her when they make up at the end of Case 6, and the game's ending where Frank lives and ponders how Frank would have lied about the story if he was alive. And unlike him, she believes in telling the truth.
But Frank's not here to tell the story his way. He can't load it up with spicy embellishments. Listening to his notes, I kind of wonder how this story would have gone when he told it later. Would he have defeated Fontana in single combat? Refused to conspire with the evil Dr. Blackburn? Added a sweet romance with the city engineer? I'm sure his second book would have sold as well as his first. But Frank's not here to tell his story, so he's got to trust me to do it, whether he wanted it that way or not. And I say, the truth is better than fiction.
But when it comes to why players also think she fails at being the answer to Frank's attitude, you don't have to play the game for long to find an example.
Some kind of bio-weaponized version of Miles. Damn it! What the hell are you doing? What happened to get the story and get out?
I couldn't just. You were just gonna leave her? Just use her?
We need to get out of here. Do you understand me?
For your pictures? Your stupid pictures?
I'm a reporter, Vic. That's what I do. I report. And if you can't do the same, if you can't take yourself out of the picture, then you should get the hell out of here!
Whatever you think of Frank's mentality here, he's not wrong. A reporter's job is to report the story, not affect it. The fact that she then leaves Frank to die at the hands of what she knows to be an armed military organization that, mind you, she dragged him into is disproportionate and deplorable, no matter how mean Frank was. And this is just the start of the game. I could end the segment here. Vic starts on the worst possible foot, never gets any better, and the game treats her as the nice and responsible one. But it misses one of the key problems with Vic. She's too emotionally immature to serve as the sensible one to see how the situation really is. Vic's response to learning about cloning is the first display of this. She says she isn't leaving until she burns the place to the ground. Never mind that this would kill a lot of soldiers, which she was not happy about the idea of Frank doing so early in the game, and that she has no real means to even do this in the first place. When shown something that she herself sees as reprehensible, she prioritizes the destruction of the facility over letting the public know about it, despite that burning the place to the ground would destroy the evidence. If Vic was able to carry out her threat, no one would likely ever learn about what happened in Willamette because of plausible deniability. And, you know, Vic going to jail for involuntary manslaughter en masse. This isn't the only example of Vic acting solely off of emotions without thinking things through, but there's a weird example that goes through the whole game. This idea that getting paid for journalism is immoral. The idea of not prioritizing profit over the situation is understandable, but Vic actively takes pride in her not profiting off the suffering of those in Willamette, claims that Frank is little more than a poacher, and steals his camera at gunpoint while destroying evidence to make sure he can't just sell it to the highest bidder. Frank was wanting to send that to presumably the New York Times. What the hell is he supposed to do? Is he supposed to put it all on 4chan or Pastebin and let the public revolt? Start a YouTube channel and just hope people listen to him? And she doesn't consider that without the hard drive, it becomes much easier to deny what happened. They can just say whatever was on the camera was faked. For how often this game loves to pay lip service to doing things the right way this time, it doesn't seem interested in showing what the right way is or the wrong way was, beyond Vic is right and Frank was wrong. And that leads to the final issue. The overall problem with Vic from a moral standpoint is that the game cares more about Frank's insensitive actions than Vic's vindictive ones. Vic does equal or worse things and is only criticized by Frank, who himself is regularly said to not be an ethical character. Vic doesn't like Frank having to kill a security guard, but wants to burn down a facility filled with them. Vic can't just leave some poor cloned woman suffering, but she can easily leave Frank who hurt her feelings to die. Frank was bad for leaving Darcy tied up, yet we're just gonna forget that Vic actively tied someone up at gunpoint. Vic criticizes Frank for caring about the story more than the people, yet Vic would rather destroy evidence than let Frank have it. Damn the consequences if it damns Frank as well. But all of this is stuff other reviewers have said, so I won't waste any more time on that. Instead, let me mention something that others, myself included, have glossed over. For how much Vic likes to talk about how she and Kylie, unlike Frank and Tom, actually care about the people of Willamette, there's never a moment in the game, or in the various documents, where Vic goes out of her way to help people. To clarify, one of the collectible stories and a few of Vic's cloud updates show she was set up in the winery, a very defendable position, and will trade food, water, and blankets for the stories of the survivors. This is fine, it's the only ethical action she has going for her. But here's what you will never find in a cutscene, any dialogue, or collectible story bit. Vic Chu going out of her way to help someone. Every time Vic tries to help someone, it is both from a safe location and with the express intent of learning about the story. Sure, she'll still give survivors supplies even if they have no worthwhile information, but there's never an example of her deciding to head straight first into danger to save someone else. Vic Chu never risks her life for anyone. Not until the very end of Case 6, and even then only because the opportunity presents itself. But Frank saves Hammond at no direct benefit to himself. The many side quests are about Frank saving survivors and clearing out the overrun shelters. And, you know, Frank chooses to die so Vic can live. The game was so caught up in showing Vic as being able to look after herself and being disappointed in Frank for only thinking of himself that they forgot to show or even indicate that Vic was interested in, let alone capable of taking care of others, without them helping contribute to her one-upping Frank. In the game's finale, Vic run past survivors fending for themselves because keeping the story away from Frank matters more than the survivors do. This is never commented on. By itself, that's not a big deal, but combine that with how Vic Chu engages in identical awful behavior to Frank, but receives none of the criticisms he does, especially from Brad, is supposed to be the reliable narrator of the two in a game that is basically lying about who Frank is, because its story can't happen otherwise, is a character whose role in the story could have been given to other characters more relevant with less screen time, and whose entire function as a character inherently subverts the guy on the box people paid money to play as. And the question isn't, how do people hate Vic? It becomes, what is there to like about her? There is one thing that changed between my original review and this revisit. I originally thought that Fontana was the most poorly written character in Dead Rising 4, thanks to her sheer lack of consistency. But giving Vic a close study this time through reminded me of something. First, I was so focused on how little she added to the story in my original review that I didn't focus on how terrible her character actually was. Or rather, I took it for granted how obvious that was. And second, I remembered why I stopped watching every frame a pause. Character consistency is not the most important thing to making a good character. It is important, it's not something to ignore, but there's worse problems than inconsistency you can have. Fontana being an inconsistent villain whose actions contradict each other based on what makes her the cool, tough woman in that scene will never be as detrimental as a character whose role in the story is to undermine the main character, let alone a legacy character of the franchise. I don't know if the subversion of Frank was something they deliberately did to build up the new gal for future games or not, and Frank Rising indicated they saw the need to backtrack it anyway. But what I do know is this: Vic was never going to be well received by the fanbase. If Vic herself was a better character with a more pleasant personality, she would still be disliked because the game uses her to be better Frank, while making Frank himself less than a parody of his older appearances. If Frank was actually Frank West in Dead Rising 4 and didn't act like a jerk for his own amusement and laziness, or if you just replaced Frank with a character made uniquely for this game, Vic would still be a snarky, preachy, frustrating, and disposable character in a game that already has too many characters for its own good. To make fans like Vic Chu as a character, Dead Rising 4 would have to tell a fundamentally different story, and Vic herself would have to be a fundamentally different character. Vic Chu is the worst character in any Capcom-published game to date, and cutting all of her scenes out of the game would make the story almost tolerable.